questions. So Claire Stanley is our moderator today. She's going to be fielding the discussion. We are going to be taking questions, I think, a little bit later in the chat. I'll be reading them out, and then we can discuss. I will leave it to the other panelists to maybe introduce themselves. So Claire, why don't you introduce yourself and then pass it on?
Great. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you're coming from. My name is Claire Stanley. I am on the board with America Walks. I work for the National Disability Rights Network, or NDRN. We are a membership organization in DC that helps do advocacy across the country through many other entities that Anna can tell you about. And I'm really excited to be here and talk about this great topic. I feel like I could not do any justice to introduce our two speakers today, so I'll go ahead and have them introduce themselves. So today we have Anna and then we have Paulo. So Anna, do you want to jump in and introduce yourself?
Sure, wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Zivarts, and I'm the director of the Disability Mobility Initiative, which is a program housed within Disability Rights Washington here in Washington State. And I am a white woman in my 30s. I have big, chunky glasses on that are also thick lenses, and I'm sitting pretty close to the camera. I'm low vision, and so that's how I can kind of see what's going on. And yeah, she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you from Seattle. And I'll let Paulo introduce himself. And we have a video to share if it works. If it doesn't, we can paste that link in the chat and you all can check it out on your own time. This streaming thing with videos is always a challenge. So Paulo, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm Paulo Nunes-Ueno, he, him pronouns, and I am the lead for transportation and land use policy for an organization called Front and Centered, statewide organization in Washington State that is a membership organization with over 70 member orgs that are all of whom are by and for people of color. And the work that we do is really centered on climate justice and environmental justice and amplifying the voices of people in the front lines of those issues. And we have three program areas where we work on energy, we work on pollution reduction, and we work on transportation. And we've had such an honor and just so lucky to be able to collaborate with Anna and Disability Rights Washington for the last 2 years. And we're really excited to share with you a little bit about the work that we're doing and to engage in a discussion. So I think we're doing about half and half. Is that right, Anna? Or we're going to spend 20
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And Claire has some questions for us, I think, to help us start and give you all some background on how we came to be.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for introducing yourselves. As you guys can see, our listeners, these two panelists have a great wealth of knowledge to bring to the table. So I feel like I'm just going to sit here and read the questions, and they're going to bring all the great wisdom to you guys. Before we jump into the questions, were we going to air the video first?
It still says it's processing, so Anna, you can try to stream it from your end if you want.
We can always stream it at the end, maybe as we're waiting for people to get their questions ready for us. And I think we can jump in and talk about the work ahead of time. And I'll paste those links in the chat right now
Cool.
in a minute, so y'all can.
Also, this is Hannah. I got a note that some of the links are not really going to work really well with screen readers. So after this is over, we can also send follow-up links to all the participants, and then you can go look at everything in your own time.
That sounds like a great idea. Yeah, so let me just give you a quick background on how we started doing this work, Paulo and I, and how we came together to do that. So Disability Mobility Initiative is a program. We're a pretty new program. within Disability Rights Washington. And we started about a year ago. And my background coming into this was with organizing and storytelling as a tool for organizing. And so that's really the focus of our work here at the Disability Mobility Initiative. And so we began our work in trying to reach out and connect with non-drivers from every community, every legislative district in our state. There's 49. And so we reached out and we started interviewing folks, and then including those interviews on what we call our story map resource as a way to be more visible and to document our stories. And one thing I want to just touch on is why we're doing this, about why we say non-drivers and not just disabled folks. The reason we do that is because we want to be able to do this from an intersectional perspective. We want to be able to talk about the needs of those of us who are disabled and can't drive because of a disability, but also folks who may not necessarily identify as disabled, but still aren't able to drive or can't afford a car. We want to be able to work across communities with folks who are recently immigrated to our country, folks who have recently gotten out of prison, and folks for whom, car ownership is just not affordable, or gas or parking just, are huge burdens financially. And so that's how we came to start to do this work, and how I was able to connect with Paulo, who comes to this work not from the disability perspective, but from communities of color who are organizing in our state for environmental justice. Paulo, do you want to talk a little bit about your listening sessions, and then we can, how we connected?
That's right. So our participation in this work was really born out of the sort of great frustration that we saw, and everybody knows this, that in Washington State, 45% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. And we've got one of the highest rates of asthma in the country, where 1 in 8 women in Washington have asthma, 1 in 14 men have asthma, a high number of children have asthma, that are really, really understood to be closely linked to emissions from transportation. And yet, when it came time to do transportation policy at the state level, at the county and the local level, all of that knowledge seems to fly out of people's heads, and the only concern, well, a variety of other concerns that have nothing to do with the reality of the climate crisis and the environmental health damages that transportation do. So our hope was to say, how can we play in this arena to really amplify the voices of the folks that are most impacted by the broken way in which we do transportation in Washington State. And that seemed to be such a clear nexus to the work that Anna was doing, in terms of amplifying those voices of folks that can tell the story of a non-system where the city, the state highway agency, and the transit agency don't work together, so that she takes 3 buses to try to get to Kmart, and there's 35 feet of missing sidewalk at the very end of that 90-minute trip that keep her from crossing the street and going to Kmart. And it's those voices that we're missing from the conversation. At the same time, we really wanted to be able to create data tools that really clearly shine a light on the the missing link, if you will, between this idea of pollution, health impacts, the climate changing emissions and transportation, and their impacts on frontline communities, primarily Black and Brown and low income communities. So this year we partnered with Disability Rights Washington and with 350 Washington and with Rocky Mountain Institute as to roll out this tool that is a highway pollution calculator, so that we were so happy that the Rocky Mountain Institute has created this peer-reviewed method for us to be able to take the information that we're getting from our highway department and plug it in and say to our legislators, if you say that you care about the climate, if you say that you care about public health and environmental justice, this project that is increasing lane miles by however many lane miles will make those problems worse. So it's fine if you say, I don't care about climate, I don't care about public health, I care about this road. That's a consistent position. We really wanted to go and be able to talk to folks that are purportedly allies and are making decisions without the full benefit of the impacts that they would be causing. So that is one of the pillars, and the other pillar of this work that we've done together is to develop this transportation bill of rights. And it's something that I think really kind of differentiates this approach that Anna and my organization and others have taken than the work that's been done to now in advocacy, where we're just going to our communities and doing listening sessions and asking people, where do you feel like your rights as a person are being violated when you try to get from place to place? And it's a very basic ask, and we're really stressing the importance of approaching this from the point of view of justice and not from the point of view of these technical questions of congestion relief or the way that engineering and the sort of prerogatives of the highway building industry tend to obscure the view of what happens to real people's lives when we make decisions like these.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I think that it just is a great way to show that two different causes can come together. And even though on the surface they might be slightly different, we can really work together for a cause. And I think this is a great example of that. With that in mind, can both of you talk about how coming together, kind of some of the ideas of what your organizations are doing have shifted a little bit and how they've shifted conversation going on in the state of Washington? And then can you also talk about what you're realizing is possible and what you should be asking in the work you're doing?
Sure, I can jump in with that, and then Paulo can jump in afterwards. So this is Anna, and I think, for us, what this has really, as we started doing interviews with folks across the state, we were hearing the same things that Paulo was hearing in the listening sessions that Front and Center was doing, that the system was really broken. Our transportation system is not working for people who can't drive, and it's not working for people who can drive, who are from frontline communities. It's the resulting climate change. We just are having some really horrendous flooding here in Washington State yesterday. The impacts of air pollution, the impacts of crashes and injuries and deaths from collisions, and then the impacts in our community in particular of non-drivers and disabled non-drivers around who doesn't have access to get to where they need to go, who is stuck at home, who is isolated. I think, the pandemic gave many people a taste of that for the first time in their lives. What does it feel like to not be able to leave your home? What does it feel like to be disconnected from your community? And it's not a great feeling. And so we recognize that we have a real intense desire to see a different system in place and different investment priorities, and not the status quo. And I think that's really the power that we've been able to build together with Front and Center with Paulo, is that our communities recognize that the system is failing us so profoundly that solutions that sort of tinker around the edges, that give a little bit more money for ADA improvements, or a little bit more money for a sidewalk, or a little bit of money for EV charging stations, those are not the solutions our communities demand, right? And because we are both from organizations that are working in this grassroots organizing space, those are the people that we answer to, right? It's not those are our constituents. those are the voices that we need to hear. And so we can bring that truth and help those voices, help those people organize together so that their voices are actually heard in places where more often than not, they're not. And one sort of beautiful thing about the pandemic for us here in Washington was that for the first time, our legislative hearings were online. And so you could provide remote testimony. And that really opened the door to having a lot more voices from people who normally, to get to our state capitol is a huge difficulty on public transit. And from more, remote parts of the state. And so for people to be able to testify for the first time and for legislators to actually hear from constituents in their communities, a quarter of us in Washington state don't drive. And yet we're pretty darn invisible in all these places where transportation decisions get made. And so I think that was the power, is that we were able to speak that truth, that this system is really failing us.
Paula, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that was pretty perfect. I think that, so this is our second year working together, and one of the things that we've learned and that we sort of came to, I don't know, just sort of have the courage of our convictions, is to say that, there's nothing particularly moderate or nothing particularly practical about a half-assed solution. If you're advocating to give people half a bicycle, you're really advocating to keep them stuck. And so I think where we came to in the middle of our legislative session last year was, wait a minute, the half of a victory here is not going to be enough. That we really need to be very clear that Anna said 25% of the people in Washington don't drive, and yet 4% of our state transportation budget goes to non-auto related projects. Throughout the pandemic, all of the transit agencies cut back service. Some of them dropped weekend service altogether. And you can imagine what an impact that has to the frontline communities that still had to go to work because they were essential employees. What an impact that had on people who don't drive because they have a disability or because they can't afford to have a car. And yet, those were not the voices that were shaping the policies that outside of the folks that were coming with Anna and me to give testimony. All of the testimony during all of the legislative session last year were people that were somehow associated with projects that had roadway projects that already had a long history of investment in project development, in creating their own weather, so to speak, to make them an inevitability. And yet, one of our major cities in Washington state, in Tacoma, 3/4 of their streets have no sidewalks. Where is the advocacy that's calling for that injustice to be rectified before we invest in widening highways all over the state? So, at some point, I think we'd love to be able to share the Bill of Rights, and we'd love for people to visit our joint advocacy page, where they can find the highway pollution calculator, where they can find the Bill of Rights, and also where they can find the larger framework that we're applying to this work, which is the idea of a just transition, that we're fully 100% committed to transitioning as quickly as possible away from fossil fuels, but to do so on the basis of justice and not baking in the current injustices and the current inequities of the existing transportation system.
That's great, thank you. Anna, you talked a little bit about organizing and how important that is, organizing at the grassroots level. And I think you both have done a great job of explaining the importance and the benefits of that. But turning the table a little bit, are there barriers, or what are the barriers to grassroots organizing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, organizing is hard, right? And unfortunately, I think so many organizations, folks burn out of organizing really quickly. And often it's like the folks, the youngest, least experienced staff members who get assigned to doing the organizing work because they have a lot of energy, right? And then, and don't really get the support and training they need to become, career organizers. And I think that's a real, something that we're really lacking in so much of our work. In this country broadly, is that people aren't supported and trained to be the kind of organizers that it takes to build power, because that's what we're trying to do. And I was lucky to have some folks in my life early on who trained me a little bit, right? And I got some organizing training that was super valuable. And I think that's the hope, and what I hope I can teach the younger folks that I'm working with now, who are, disabled non-drivers who are involved with our work, is how do you do organizing? And yeah, it's hard, the people who are most likely to show up and have time and energy are the folks with the most privilege, and the folks who you really need to show up, the stories, the voices who really need to be included in that room, are the folks who it's going to be the hardest to get there, right? Because they have a million other things going on in their lives, a million other really important, priorities. And yet those are the people we need to make sure can be there, and we need to figure out ways to include them. And yeah, it's going to be hard. Yeah, someone's going to ignore like 5 of your 10 phone calls, or it sometimes takes really building that deeper relationship and trust to be able to bring someone in and bring them to the table. But then once you do, and you see how excited and transformed they can feel about having a voice in something that they care about really deeply, that is beautiful. And a sort of a bigger meta thing that we're doing here with our work is how do we get more folks of color, more non-drivers, more poor folks, more immigrants into these rooms where all these transportation and funding decisions get made, and so they actually have a voice, and they're not on some sidelined accessibility committee. How do we actually bring people into those spaces and get them the training and support so they can really have an impact on the decisions that are getting made? Because ultimately, that I think is what it's going to take. And so, there's some really easy barriers that we're trying to tackle with, so many jobs in the transportation sector require driver's licenses. Jobs that aren't bus driver jobs that are like finance jobs or planning jobs, and just that alone keeps so many voices out of those rooms. But beyond that, we need to be shifting the dynamics and building power of whose voices or whose transportation needs are considered valid.
Paulo, would you say you've seen the same kinds of barriers coming from a slightly different angle, or other barriers that we should be aware of?
Well, I'm not sure that they're barriers, that they could be. So here's sort of, advice for working with an organization like Front and Centered, which is a really diverse, really sprawling, coalition of lots of different groups, is it takes us a long time to move. We when we're working with other groups, we really need them to be patient with us, because in our power really comes from knowing that we're reaching out deeply to our membership, and that it's not a straight line, and it takes a lot of conversation, and what I think the other, beyond patience, I think what I'm asking for funders is to know our work is expensive because it takes us so long, because we have to build consensus with so many different groups. And when you're comparing this to a different, well-established, mainline environmental organization, it's just a different process. That we have more steps. We have, I don't know how to say this exactly. It just takes more conversation, and we come out, I think, stronger in the end, but it takes time and it takes more resources.
That makes a lot of sense, the way you put it, Paulo. That really helps to paint a picture, and I really appreciate that. So you guys have both talked about some barriers or constraints or just difficulties or intricacies of doing grassroots work. Can you guys talk a little bit about what's worked thus far, kind of based off of all those variables you were just talking about? And Paulo, do you want to go first this time?
Sure, although I'm such a fan of the work that Anna does that I think what's worked best is the story mapping, the actually giving the microphone to folks with disabilities, to folks for whom the system is not working. And then, hopefully Anna will talk about the week without driving. But I think for us, what is, what has worked, what will continue to work is to have a very clear framework for how we look at this. So when I say, this is part of, we call the advocacy, campaign that we're doing, the just transition in transportation, and that's very intentional, and we mean that we want to stop using fossil fuels and we want to start using justice. And and our understanding of that is very forthrightly, the first step is divestment, is saying directly to our members so that they understand, so that they know what they're signing up for, but also to electeds and to the community, that when you're building a road, understand that that is just like building a pipeline. That is part of the fossil fuel infrastructure that not only will have impacts today, but will have continued impacts and baking in emissions for 60, 70 years. So we're very clear in putting this work in this framework to say we're going to divest from fossil fuels, we're going to invest in justice, and we're going to create a way in which many, many more people can participate in this conversation. And being able to work with Anna, who then has been able to give people a voice directly with a microphone, with video, and really, because I think ultimately what I think is so brilliant about this work that Anna is going to share with you, hopefully the week without a car, is that it's so easy for drivers, because we've built the world for them, to assume that everybody is well served. And what she's doing is forcing those of us who currently are able-bodied to have empathy and to imagine that they have responsibility to include more people in dignity, ultimately.
Anna?
Yeah, no, I think I will, yeah, share definitely about Week Without Driving, but I do think our power in of the work that Paulo and I are doing together is, even though it is a little slower perhaps to bring people to the table who haven't been at the table before, because it's the people whose lives are most impacted by these decisions and most negatively impacted usually, there's a real a truth speaking, a telling in that, and that there is like a moral compass to the work we're doing that I think is kind of profound. And I encourage other folks from other parts of the country who are listening to think about, rather than whose voices would have the greatest impact, or who really cares about this but might not be able to be at this table because there's no bus to get to the table, or they need childcare, or they have a second job, or they aren't fluent English speakers. What can you do to bring those other voices in? Because I think it really does change the conversation, and make it about the day-to-day needs of people for whom the system is currently broken, because that is in some ways very urgent, and has has this moral weight to it that I think can be really powerful. And so with our Week Without Driving, we invited legislators, elected leaders, and folks who are part of, leadership of transportation agencies, transit providers throughout our state to join us for a week where they could not get around driving themselves in their car. They could still ride in a car if they needed to, but they weren't, supposed to try to drive themselves. And that really, I think, even for people who are supporters, even for people who normally would bike or would ride transit occasionally, to actually have not the option of bailing out and just grabbing their keys and driving when they needed to get their kids somewhere, that I think was pretty transformational for some of them. And I'm actually spending the morning right now going through all the email responses we got from people with feedback, looking at what did they learn, what were the real gaps in the system that they weren't really aware about because they only used the system when it was convenient and not all the time. And so that's been, I encourage other folks to try doing this with your electeds as a way for them to understand what it really is like to be transit dependent.
That's great. I was very excited to hear about that program because as somebody who is dependent on public transit myself, I think that can just speak volumes. So thank you for doing that. One last question before we open the floor to questions from the audience. What comes next, you guys? What's the next step? Where do we go from here? And whoever wants to go first.
Paulo, go for it.
Well, so this is very, 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 very timely, right? Because the president just signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill yesterday. And, although on the surface, that may seem like good news, there is no guarantee that those dollars are not going to be used to go on a highway building spree that will make mobility more difficult, that will create more congestion, that will make the climate crisis worse, that will make environmental justice even a bigger problem than it is today. And so while we're working at the state level, we also are now talking and figuring out how we shift so that we use exactly the same tools that we've used so far to make sure that these new transportation dollars don't go towards new highways that are going to displace communities of color, don't go towards creating more inequity, but really, rectify the problems that those kinds of investments have made up until now. And so, unfortunately, in Washington State, we have perceived our state constitutional prohibition on how to spend the gas tax very, very strictly. Those prohibitions don't exist at all, as far as we understand, with federal dollars. And we need to completely reprogram where those are going so that, when we move into a house in America today, for the most part, nobody sits there and thinks, I hope there's running water. I hope there's electricity. And yet that is the case that everybody has to ask themselves, I hope there are sidewalks. I hope there's transit. And that is just plain wrong. It's just an incredible inequality that we've tolerated for so long, and we shouldn't have to anymore. And that's what these dollars should be for, is to make sure that every transit agency in our state has a 15-minute frequent transit spine, that a mile radius from every single stop has sidewalks and bike lanes and curb cuts so that people can get to transit. It's not a lot to ask. Once we step back and say, oh, we're really committed to justice, then it's not an enormous thing to ask. It's the basics of treating everybody with dignity. And so that's what I think has come next, is sort of same tools, kind of pivoting and making sure that we're saying, hey, these dollars need to go for solving the problems that we've made, but also to making the kind of future that we want, instead of doubling down on what the fossil fuel industry wants.
Yeah, that's great. Anna?
Yeah, no, I mean, ditto to what Paulo said. And I think, you know, it really comes down to how can we ensure that even if you don't have access to a car, that you still have the ability to get around and be an active member of your community. And, you know, in Seattle, we have, you know, incredible wealth in this city in this moment, right? You think of Amazon, Microsoft, Expedia, like so much wealth. And yet barely 50% of our sidewalks where they do exist, and there's a lot of places in the city where they don't, are in walkable condition, rollable condition. We just have completely ignored the needs of non-drivers, and that, you know, that's not okay. And so how do we change that and make it so that people, you know, more broadly, people who do have the privilege to drive recognize what a failure this is, both to non-drivers, but also to everyone else who wants a healthy, livable planet. So yeah, I think that's the conversation that we're trying to have, and the narrative that we need to change.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I'm so excited to hear about all the work you guys are doing. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I think we need more and more people out there, you know, shaking chains and making noise. So thank you so much. Quick check-in. We have about 20 minutes, so we can do questions from the audience. But before we do that, status on the video, are we able to do that?
It's still processing, so I guess in the year of our 2021, we still do not have this technology.
No
However,
problem.
what we do have is a lot of audience questions. So let's knock some out. I'm gonna read through these, and then I'll just let y'all like decide who feels most like ready with an answer, okay? Okay, here we go. So Rachel says, sprawl drives the perceived need for so much transportation by car. How do we repair the physical and social damage caused by sprawl? And how do we show that moderate density and mixed use living is safer, more efficient, more equitable, and more fun?
You know, what that makes me think of is the part of our work, and I think that we want to give this more energy. I think is also bringing the perspective and the voice of children in the conversation more power. And I you know, so in one of our Bill of Rights elements, we say that all children who want to should be able to safely bike or walk to school, or bike and walk to a bus stop, and or roll if they're using a wheelchair and or assistive device. And I think that one of the really important things when we look at these longer midterm questions of middle you know, not long term, not immediate, but in the 5-10 year horizon, is thinking that it's possible for communities where the roadway network is primarily made up of arterials and disconnected cul-de-sacs to work within that community to create walking and rolling paths that make it much shorter for people to get to bus stops, for people to get to parks and to schools. That is creating a whole right of way network that is not the streets. But it's an incredibly difficult body of work because you're negotiating easements between houses. You're negotiating, you know, a path that will connect one cul-de-sac to the other in between two backyards. But it can be done. And I think it's, you know, it's you know, decades worth of work, but we need to start retrofitting the suburbs so that there are better and you know, so that there's more than one way to get around.
Yeah, this is Anna, and just building off what Paulo said, I think, you know, this may not be universal in every part of the country, but in Washington State right now, because of the economic growth we've had, the affordability of the places in our state that are most walkable, that have the best transit service, those have become really unaffordable to many folks, including many folks with disabilities who, are on fixed income. And so what we see is that whether people want to or not, they are living further and further out in suburban or ex-urban or even rural communities. And they still need transit, and they still need safe places to walk and roll. And so, it is not impossible for us to have, connect pathways through rural areas, multi-use paths where people have the opportunity to get from point A to point B. It's not impossible for us to have rural transit service. These are things that, we've had historically, and we can have again. It's just a matter of priorities. And so, while it is perhaps easier and more efficient to provide, service in dense areas, I think we can't walk away from the places in our state that the people with the greatest need are actually can afford to live. And so for us, that is, a big part of the conversation here is how do we improve rural transit service? In some of our tribal areas like the Yakama Nation, they're building a big a trail network because people do walk 20 miles down the side of a highway to get to town who don't have access to a car. And so, we need to be thinking about these needs outside of urban areas as well.
And I think the thing that I would add to that is that the sort of key component of this solution is for us to change the really unfair expectation that transit is going to be primarily 90%, 80% funded by local dollars, because that in and of itself makes it so difficult for smaller communities to have the transit that we know that they need. So the state needs to play a much bigger role in funding transit operations.
All right, you ready for another question?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Also, that was great. And I just want to chime in and say I love the emphasis on the suburbs because, Anna, you're exactly right. Like, people are getting priced out of city centers, whether they want to be or not. So we can't, just expect people to somehow be able to move back to walkable places when they haven't gotten, a pay raise ever. So here is a question from Stephanie, and I think this is such a good question. How do you deal with the accusation that reducing car dependence is elitist? And then in quotes, she has quote, only able-bodied cyclists who live in urban areas can get around without cars.
I can start with that. This is Anna. So, I do think, that is the beauty in our work in centering the voices of non-drivers is that, we are the embodiment of how that isn't true. And how that, if you ride the bus, if you're walking places that aren't designed for walking, and yet there's a lot of people walking there anyway, those people aren't doing it because it's a fun or enjoyable thing to do. It's because that is the only option. And so, I think we are largely invisible, and because the people who have the most time and ability to show up at community hearings and be on Twitter have a lot of privilege, and so those are the non-drivers that people sort of are stereotypical non-drivers, but that's not who we're centering in our work, and I think that's our power.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, this one's pretty basic, but I actually think it's a good thing to dive into. Bill asks, can you give a brief overview of how you managed to launch the Week Without Driving initiative? Like, how did that go? What did that organizing look like?
Sure. Yeah. And this is one of those things where I wish we'd had more time to sort of launch it. But because of the sort of timing of our legislative session and needing to have it happen sooner than later, we just started reaching out to folks, and we started reaching out to all the other, advocacy orgs in the state who do transportation adjacent work to see if they would co-sponsor and help us reach out to electeds that they knew. I think, while we had wonderful participation from a lot of folks in the greater Puget Sound area, we have a big state, and I'm hoping in future years that we have the time and the resources to spend more time in other communities throughout the state and really get more folks, to participate. we did hear quite a few interesting responses from legislators who we reached out to. We reached out to every legislator in our state, and some were very kind and explaining to us why they couldn't participate because this is where they lived and this is what their life was like. And I think even for the folks who said no, having to think about it and send us that email was great. Was a real step forward.
I love that even sending the no email required an amount of thought. I think that's very important, even just to push that question.
Oh.
All right, I have one last question. It's kind of long. It is, but I think it's really good because it's quite practical, and I feel like we could offer this viewer some advice. So Crystal says, I truly love this presentation and learning about the work you're doing. So powerful. Have a few questions. So Crystal is working on a project to provide ADA access to a paved urban multi-use trail in Minneapolis, for which there's currently no ADA compliant access for 1.5 miles. I'm struggling to communicate the benefits of this to the community members who currently have no trouble using the steep wood chip paths. I also don't feel like we have enough voices of those who would most benefit. So any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think understanding what people's needs are and desires are and having that work center, those voices is really key. And so, while I think we could all point out a lot of things in our communities that aren't accessible, that don't meet ADA standards, I think, there's sort of like the chicken and the egg thing, right? If the thing isn't accessible, then no one's even going to try to use it or even want to use it, right? And so that's part of it. But I really do think, doing the organizing work, connecting to disability orgs, advocacy orgs in your own community and asking folks there what their transportation priorities are. And if it's that path, great, but it may be something else, right? And being willing to take that, take the lead from the folks who say, okay, well, actually, that's bad, but this bus stop I can't get to, and that's something I need to do every day. And so, figuring out who the people are who, have concerns and want to be active and what those concerns are, and centering the work around that, I think can, help you build to a more accessible, inclusive community in the long term.
Paula, what are your organizing suggestions for something like this, for a project like this, where you're trying to get more people on board?
Well, I think that it would be really interesting to invite folks for whom the wood chip path may not work to try it, and to bring other folks from the community to say, all right, well, let's experience what this might be like. And also, I think Anna has a good point. Maybe, I mean, look, I think that this idea of a very small project unlocking a tremendous network of access is really important, and being able to for somebody that has no problem getting there is assuming all of the benefits of the network without any of the barriers. And so, somehow getting that across to people that, this it may seem like a small and insignificant project, but look at all of the places that this will allow people to go. So I don't know if that's super helpful.
So this is Claire. We have about 7 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to get them in now. If we don't have any questions, we're going to end the meeting by turning it over to our Executive Director of America Walks to put in a few words. But let's give just a couple more seconds to see if we get maybe one more question.
Oh, we have more.
Oh, perfect. Awesome. Great.
Let me pull one more. We have a lot. There's
okay.
30 in here.
Anna.
Also, several of the questions are asking, if this recording is going to be available. Yes. Are we going to send notes around afterwards? Yes. I will be sending a message to all the attendees afterwards with a bunch of resources, a bunch of links, and then I'm also going to be recapping it sort of with some pull quotes and some more resources in a blog post on the America Walks blog at some point this week. So I will make sure to keep everyone posted. So let's see here. Okay. This is one last question. It's kind of a big, hard one, but I think it's also important. Kevin says, electric cars are dominating the national discussion regarding climate emissions from cars. How do we break through regarding the limitations of that approach?
Well,
I shouldn't. Go ahead, Paulo. Go for it.
So I guess, this is nobody who is stuck in traffic sits there and says, well, at least I'm in an electric car. Nobody who's circling a parking garage trying to find a place to park and can't find one says, well, at least I'm in an EV. Nobody whose child was killed in a car accident says, well, at least she was killed by an electric vehicle. So the notion that we're going to get to a just transportation system by baking in the inequities and the perversions of the one that we have by simply electrifying cars is just wrong on its face, and I think that we should have an easy time swatting that away.
Yeah, I mean, and then, it's not going to work for folks who can't drive, which is who our constituency is. So we have just straight up, not a future. And even this idea that autonomous vehicles are going to provide people the mobility freedom someday that, driving would, I think is really a false promise. And that even with Uber right now, with ride hail broadly, most of the folks we talk to in our state overwhelmingly can't afford ride hail because they are on fixed income, because they have a difficult time finding jobs with our limited transportation system for non-drivers. And so, yeah, I mean, it's even all the press and tantalizing promises of the autonomous electric future, those aren't, people recognize that that's not really going to work for them. It's not intended to really serve poor folks who it's just not going to work for. And so I think that's why we need to be looking at this just transition work much more broadly and getting to, how can we have communities that work for all of us truly.
Great. Thank you so much, Paulo and Anna. That was so informative and so great. And I know I learned a lot. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And Mike, if you are there, you have the floor to close us out.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Anna and Paulo. And thank you, Claire. Claire's on our board as well. I mean, I wanted to put on this webinar ever since I've seen this, the work of the Disability Mobility Initiative and their partnership with Front and Centered. And, there's just so many, if you're an organizer, if you're an advocate, there's so many things to take away from this. I think, first of all, so much of our advocacy feels like we're trying to accommodate our objectives around driving and the needs of drivers. Whether it's protecting the bike lane or finding or getting a crosswalk or things like that. And what's so powerful about this is that it's centering the needs and the voices of non-drivers. And if you're an advocate, just that approach is so powerful to begin with, and really asking legislators that question. There's so many great insights from this as well. But if you're an organizer too, just look at the tactics. First of all, the coalition, that it's disability advocates, as well as immigrant and refugee communities, as well as children or seniors, whoever cannot drive. So it's a broad group of advocates here. It's not narrow. The tactics, the week without driving is a fabulous tactic. really informative. I really recommend going to the Disability Mobility Initiative and looking at their story map, in which they did videos of people from different communities around the state, really making the point that this is not a regional issue or affecting only a certain city, that it's the whole state, and that there are people with disabilities or who do not drive throughout the entire state, and those are constituents of all legislators. So just from a pure craft of organizing level, I'm just so impressed by this. So at America Walks, we, it's our voice, it's our job to support local advocacy and lift up the value of the ability to walk and move with dignity in your communities without hindrance, and be able to reach the opportunities, the services, the community, the people that you want to reach. I feel like at the national level, we're doing our best to lead on this, whether it's, fixing the manual of uniform traffic control devices, the most important pedestrian safety document you've never heard of, and until maybe this year, where we all got it in the news and got 25,000 comments into the Federal Register. We train advocates through our walking colleges, our national and state walking colleges, and we do our best to bring out stories and voices like the ones you heard today. So if you think this is leading to a request for dollars, it is. In order for us to have the freedom to speak about the things we want to speak about, to push for the things we want to push for, the dollars that you contribute as unrestricted funds for a nonprofit like ours are immensely valuable. So, go to americawalks.org, find the donate page, consider becoming a monthly supporter, for $5 or $10 a month. You can help make sure that our voice is heard and we lift up other voices. And while you're at it, go take a look at the Disability Mobility Initiative and Front and Centered, and think about supporting them financially as well. I know they would really appreciate it. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to everybody who attended and participated in this webinar, and look forward to seeing you out there working for a community that really works for everybody, which doesn't push people to the edges and the fringes and leaves people out. If it's anything that I think America Walks stands for, and I know these advocates stand for, is that everybody belongs to be a full, dignified member of their communities. So thank you.
Nice work, everybody. We did it. Thank you all so much. If you signed up, you're on the email list. You'll get an email, and then keep an eye out for future correspondences from us. And also follow us on social media if you don't already. We're America Walks all over the place. Anybody want to plug anything real quick? One last plug. If you want to follow Anna or Paulo, these organizations on Twitter too, I've been tweeting quotes from this as we go. And so you can also find them and see what kind of righteous stuff they're up to in the future.
Thank you, everyone. And yeah, I will make sure that you have our contact information as well. I think Paulo and I are both happy to share what we've learned and help other folks in other communities learn and grow this movement with us.
Right on.
Yeah, what a
Thank
pleasure.
you, everybody.